Welcome, everybody. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thank you for being with us as always. Pleased to bring you a conversation here that's going to really cover a whole lot about project-based learning. It's a topic that, of course, comes up a lot in education, but there are things that are good to know about it. There's challenges. There's places where people are calling things PBL that isn't exactly PBL, right? So I think we're going to get into all of that and give you some ideas, some strategies, some things you might want to try to advance in your environments. So my guest today is Ryan Steuer. Ryan is an author, podcaster, and thought leader who specializes in PBL. He's a curious visionary who is a former engineer at a Fortune 50 company and a former 8th grade English teacher who now leads Magnify Learning, which is a PBL professional development company. And they customize their trainings every time, according to what I have here. Ryan is author of a book called PBL Simplified, 6 Steps to Move Project-Based Learning from Idea to Reality. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ross, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. Thanks.
And we'll start out with a big question, and I'm sure there's many parts to this, but you can distill it down to what you believe is most compelling to start us off here, which is what is the case for PBL? What's the evidence? What are you using as the determiner for why you determined that you wanted to commit to this and really advance this in schools?
Sure. I think my why comes from my experience. I think is where that always starts from. And I was an engineer and enjoyed it, but it wasn't a passion of mine. Turned out my favorite 2 days actually were the 2 days that we were working with kids out of United Way. And it was like, oh, okay, maybe I want to do something else in my life. So jumped ship to 8th grade English and started teaching traditionally because that's what I knew. I was a good student in high school. I got a 4.2, 3-sport athlete, but kind of in some ways failed at high school, right? Because I got done. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, right? I even chose wrong. So I wanted kids to experience that, but in a traditional classroom, I wasn't getting through, right? I was big on relationships. I was in an English classroom specifically, so I could have kids write about their lives and we could get to know kids, but it wasn't moving the needle for them. I had a learner who got to high school and he flunked out of high school his first semester, actually, of his freshman year. It's like, I didn't even know that was legal. So that was kind of a wake up call. So then PBL came along and it's like, we were in a failing school. I said, we've got to try something different. And in our first year, we had a school within a school at the middle school environment. And in the first year, we had 25% of the kids, but we only had 8% of the discipline. In an F school, we would have been a B. And attendance wise, we were 1.5% higher than the rest of the school. So it was like kids were coming to school, generally doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they're performing better. And the first 3 PBL units we did, all of my kids turned in all of the things they were supposed to. It's like, what? Like that never happened, right? We were on the southwest side of Indianapolis at an urban school. Like I had kids that would finish the year with a 20%, right? Typically. And so something changed with project-based learning. So right there, it was like, this is why I left engineering, because I wanted to have an impact on kids and on people's lives. And project-based learning, like boots on the ground, like I saw that happen almost immediately. So super exciting. So honestly, that's my why, kind of right off the bat.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been having a lot of conversations about lately for a variety of podcasts and also conversations that are not recorded for the media is all about career connected learning, the ways in which states and private companies and schools together are kind of working to redefine what opportunities are available there, to redefine what we mean by college and career readiness and career and technical education and all these things, right? And how that helps to define what the goals of K-12 schools need to be. And what does it mean to have a student who is ready to graduate and ready to move on to the next step? And certainly I think that's a relevant context for thinking about what PBL can do to support that and its timeliness and relevance to thinking about, particularly with schools who know they're going through the process of iterating and redefining what is our portrait of a graduate, what are the future ready skills and competencies and what it means, and not only, okay, how do some different techniques help a student maybe have a higher level of proficiency in the core curriculum, which is important in its own right, but also how are they equipped to take those skills forward and create whatever the next thing is. And I'd love to just hear your thoughts on PBL's relevance to that piece and how it helps students to foster that variety of future ready skills that enable them to do any number of things they might want to do.
Yeah, I think that's a super nice tee up actually, Ross, of like, right, it's an extension of my why, right? So even if you look at myself and my journey, again, I got a 4.2. I did everything I was supposed to do in high school. My dad was first generation college student. So he didn't really know what to show me though to go. He just knew that engineering would be a good path forward money wise, right? And I didn't know any doctors. I didn't know nurses. I didn't. So even in my setup, and I was pretty blessed. I was at a rural school, and things were going well, right? And generally, people would say I was winning, right, the education, and I still ended up really in a place I didn't want to be. So you think about that for all of our learners. In their top 5 connections, do they have a lawyer, a doctor, a pharmacist, and an engineer? And I don't care where you want to go, but do they have people that are in the positions that they would maybe want to have? There's some really good STEM research out there that just kind of showed that when our learners are even just exposed to meeting someone who's a chemist, they're much more likely to see that as a possible career. So I think PBL is that vehicle to bring in community partners, because there's a language barrier between community partners and the school system, right? Like if I'm an engineer and I want to go help out, I can't just show up at the front desk and say, hey, I'd like to help, right? It's like, well, okay, neat. Like wait over there in that chair and I'll see what I could do. And then the engineer's making copies or something. But how do we really use people's expertise? And I think in project-based learning, there's a couple really easy ways, right? Like maybe in the entry event, when you first launch a PBL unit, you can bring in a community partner, or as an outside expert to come in the middle. It's more of an advanced move, but at least at the end at a presentation or an expo, you can bring in all these real life community partners for our learners to see that they might not see on a regular basis. And some of our learners do, of course, but some of them don't. And then you find out, oh, like Ryan's a banker and he actually went to the same school that I went to, and he had a single mom, and gosh, he's just like me. I could be a banker. And by the way, Ryan drives a BMW. That's a real life example from one of our community partners. We used to bring him in, and he would strategically place his BMW right outside the classroom window so people could see it. And then he'd come in and say, hey, guys, I went to the same school. I had to apply to a bunch of scholarships in order to get to college, but I did it, and you can too. And it's amazing what that like 30-minute talk can do. Like, yep, the standards are super important. We recommend that you start with standards when you build your PBL units. But that one interaction outside of career day, right, which is, again, can be a great event, but it's a little more canned. This was like super personal. And these kids could be like, oh, like I can see that. Like you had the path, I can take that path. It's a super important angle for PBL.
You've stated a mission of having 51% of schools that are using PBL by the year 2051, which isn't as far away as it seems, right?
Right.
We still, I mean, there's a lot of time between now and then, and yet the years tick on. How did you identify that? What's the current estimate of how many schools are using PBL, using it correctly, so that we can kind of determine what that growth looks like and why that's the benchmark?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the best estimate that I'd heard was 10 to 15% of schools using PBL. And even in that, that's probably a fuzzy number, because we would probably define authentic PBL and maybe projects. And we have some delineations we'd probably make. For us, 51 by 51 is kind of that visionary, passionate, for us to go chase. And because it was like, well, we're helping all the schools that we help across the country. We do training, coaching, and they're moving. It's like, well, what's our marker to move forward? Like, what if we get 5 more schools, 10 more schools? Like, that's great. But what would it really look like if what if the majority of our learners graduated from a PBL environment where they're now empowered? They've got communication skills, they've got problem solving skills, they've got agency, right? They're going into a career and they know how to learn on their own. They're in a career that if they like it, they'll excel. And if they don't, they'll move on. They'll go to something different because they actually know what they want to do and they've got the skills to do that. And that's what gets us pumped up. So 51 by 51, you we my team almost got hung up on kind of exactly where you went. Like, how do you measure that? I say, guys, I don't care right now, right? Like we got 37 years to figure it out, right? So, but let's move in that direction with the passion of what would it look like if our world had 51% of our learners empowered, fired up with all the skills that industry partners want? What would that look like for those learners and for our communities?
And so let's get into a little bit of, so I when I read out the full title, there's 6 steps that are listed out, and we can even, I think, simplify it a little bit for the purpose of this conversation, that
Yeah.
essentially they're covering problem, solution, evaluation, right? And there's a variety of steps, particularly in the solution phase, of understanding the potential solutions, choosing the right one, implementing. But definitely want to start with that problem piece of, I think, choosing when to use PBL, how to use it, what are we trying to address with this? Why are we determining that this is a place where we should change our processes? Why do we think this is the right way to go about it? And helping our listeners kind of start to understand that, right? Versus just saying, okay, everybody should be doing it, and it's just a blanket thing. If I'm sure if we're saying that you're doing something that is working perfectly and you're getting the outcomes you want, don't mess with that. But if there's another
Right.
place where
Yeah.
you're saying, okay, we're not getting the results we want and we need to figure out a way to do it differently, this might be a way. But yeah, how about that problem phase, that identification of those areas? What are some of the things you would advise on identifying where the opportunities are to potentially fit in some new strategies here?
Yeah, I think you hit on the idea. The 6 steps is, if you have 7 steps, you could still be really successful, right? It's not, the 6 steps aren't magical. They hover around the scientific process. And I think some of the secret sauce is, like you said, in defining the problem. When you look at your standards, there are inherently problems in there, right? There's a reason that those standards are those standards. There's a reason that argumentative writing is continually a standard, right? Because of the higher level thinking skills that need to happen, of the applicability that can be there. So what I think the secret sauce is that we try to help teachers find is that they're an expert in their content area. So how do we match their geekiness, if you will, of knowing their standards to the real world? And for a second, some teachers will have a little bit of trouble. They'll say, well, I don't really see how it applies because we've got slope intercept form. What do I do with that? But they're actually the best person to help us figure out how standards relate to the real world, because they're the go-between, right? And not everybody understands that slope intercept form is important, or that scientific method can be used almost everywhere. It's really great for your everyday life, right? But we've got science teachers that are pumped up about that. So how do we help our learners go from the real world that they see and that they live in, that's filled with problems? How do we use the content, the schooling that's a part of their every single day, to connect the two? And when we do that really well, now we have learners that see that their education applies to the real world and the things that they're doing right now. Like, the sooner we can bring the why closer to them, the better off. So that's, if you can really design a great problem and connect it to your standards, it's really the place where we can get learners to lean in a little closer. And that's what I think inquiry is really all about, right? It's not a fancy bell ringer. Inquiry is when our learners lean in and say, yeah, I actually do want to know more about that. So I'll give you an example. If a biology teacher has to teach the Punnett square, right? So they're going to be talking about genetics, and again, not inherently exciting to the average person, right? But science teachers will get fired up, but not inherently exciting. So what if you come to your 8th grade students and you say, well, I've got a doctor here, and the doctor comes in, the doctor says, every day parents find out that their kid has a genetic disease somewhere in the world. And those parents immediately want to know 2 things. They want to know, number one, is my child going to be okay? And number 2, they want to know everything there is to know about that genetic disease. Hey, 8th graders, will you help create pamphlets for my office? And heads go up, and 8th graders say, well, actually, yes, I do. I actually do want to help people do that, right? And then the science teacher comes back in and says, okay, well, you guys are fired up. Let's do this. You're going to need to know about the Punnett square. You need to know about genetics. 8th grader raises their hand. What in the world is a Punnett square? Oh, well, if you guys want to help this doctor, you're going to have to learn that. Do you guys want me to teach you that? Well, yeah, I guess you should teach me that so that I can help solve this problem. And that's the dynamic switch that we really want. in a PBL environment is that I'm now learning my content so that I can solve this real world problem. And that's my real engagement. It's not necessarily a grade. There's still grades, right? But it's like the grade isn't my motivation. It's to solve this problem. So defining the problem becomes a really important aspect.
Yeah. And so then once that's well defined, and let's say, okay, I think that PBL could be a good solution to this problem that we're having. Are there a variety of ways of going about that? Is there how does that look, I guess? Is that a
Sure.
matter of scale, of saying, are we committing to a school-wide thing versus just the classroom? Are we doing PBL that applies to a particular unit versus our daily practice? Or what are the different ways that there might be, I guess, some variability in how an educator or a school might choose to implement PBL, and determine how it fits into the problem that they've identified?
Sure. So yeah, at a systems level, maybe you've identified a problem of engagement levels. You want to raise engagement levels. And we had a group out in Maryland had the same thing. So we want to raise student engagement levels. So we're going to use project-based learning to as one of our means to tackle this engagement issue. And at this district level in Maryland, they used actually a content area. So the social studies department brought in project-based learning, and they created PBL units within, the social studies arena K-12. And that's how they started their implementation. And it's grown from there to other subject areas, but that's how they started. Some schools will say, yep, like we're going all in, and they'll bring everybody in and do a full training with their school. And obviously, if you do that, everybody's going to implement at a little bit different level, right? Because teachers are at different skill levels or different experience levels. And then you kind of coach within that. But we all have this North Star that we're moving towards a PBL environment. And some schools will do something a little bit different, and they'll do something called learning teams. And this is actually one of our favorite implementation models is you get a group that says, we're going to go learn about PBL and see if it works at our school. And I actually like learning teams better than saying a prototype or we're going to just try this. So we're going to go find out if it works here. And you get a leadership team that said, we're going to be our learning team, and they go get trained. And now those teachers, probably a coach, an AP, they're going to bring PBL back to their areas of expertise, their classrooms, and they're going to implement. And what we find happens is now you've got success stories from that local school, right? Everybody knows Victor in your school, right? And Victor, when he presented, like, go watch him. Like, how in the world did you get Victor to do that, right? And now instead of, because I can give you a bunch of PBL research, right? Like the Lucas Foundation just did a really great study back in 2021, right? Super strong research. But most of the time, if I'm a teacher in the classroom, I want to know if it's just going to help my classroom, right? It's neat that it worked over there. I'm excited about that. I'm glad it's research based, but what about my classroom? And in these learning teams, that you're actually answering that question. You're saying, look what happened with our learners in our community. Watch how PBL is affecting their learning. And it becomes a really powerful model then, because now you've got the other teachers that weren't involved in that learning team saying, hey, I want to get trained? Can I get in on this? When do my learners get to interact with the community partners and be in the newspaper and those kind of things? And it's a little bit more of a gradual implementation, if you will, instead of a top-down mandate of we're all doing PBL. And right, if you're doing something different, you're wrong. And we've never taken that stance because we know that teachers are working really hard and it's a very personal profession. So the learning teams seem to be a great way to get started.
How much does terminology matter in the case of PBL? I mean, is it important for educators to be using particular terminology and kind of defining common understanding around that? Anything for students? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, great question. There's some that I think tends to matter. Now, if you say driving question versus essential question, I'm not sure that matters a whole lot.
Mhm.
We do have some geeky vocabulary, right? Entry events and need to knows and end products and those kind of things. Sometimes it's helpful to bring it in to show that we're doing something different, right? There is a different process to this. And I mentioned that 6 steps doesn't really matter, but clarity does, right? So we are doing something different. Like most of us grew up in a very traditional environment where a teacher told us what to learn. We did that. We wrote it down. And in fact, most of us as teachers were really good at that. So that's what we tend to do. So bringing in the new vocabulary can be helpful to show that something's different, something different's happening here. One other tweak that I think is really important, it's not like I have to, but it's an interesting idea when it comes about is I'll often use the term learner instead of student
Yeah.
just to change the mindset of that learner, right? That's sitting in the seat. And even for the teachers, a lot of times they'll adopt the term facilitator. They're now facilitating learning and they're giving up some of that control to the learner. And as soon as I use that term of giving up control, there's kind of shivers that go through some. You're not giving the keys to the kids. Like you're still the educator. You're in charge of the classroom. You're empowering those learners, though. So sometimes the vocabulary can matter, just because it changes mindsets.
So then, as far as reflection, evaluation, are there parts of this that are the qualitative versus the quantitative, and how does it differ, if it does, from any instructional practice and outcomes? And are there specific things when it comes to PBL that would be part of that? Is it mostly just how did our students learn, and then we can tell if what we did worked, and what does that process look like?
Yeah, I think that if it does, like if it does differ, is a really important phrase because I think there's a lot of things that don't change, right? You're still going to have summative assessments, you're going to have formative assessments. You still need to know if Susie knows complete sentence, compound sentences, and those kind of things. You still have to assess everyone's learning. Those things are still happening. You can still have that unit test at the end of the unit. You're still going to have 5-paragraph essays, right? Like all those things are still in there when you're assessing your student learning. We might add some things like how do you start to assess student collaboration, right? Like there's some great tools out there, some great rubrics. But most of the time, the conversation is the most important thing, actually. Like, how are we going to assess student collaboration? Because if you're not assessing it, you're probably not really getting it. You're not teaching it and bringing it to a higher level. So you start to ask, how do we assess presentation skills? And those are really fun conversations for educators to have. And you just get educators around the table and you can do most of it in one faculty meeting, right? You won't have a fully defined rubric, but you have all the ideas there and somebody can put it all together. And it's a really neat idea. And now you can start bringing it out to your learners and they can start to see, oh, I'm here and I could be here in collaboration and working with others, right? And those are really powerful skills. We started with industry standard skills. Those are the ones that are going to really catapult our learners further in their college and career goals.
What are some of the pitfalls commonly with the PBL implementation?
Yeah, sure. You mentioned kind of defining PBL for us. That authenticity is a big part for us at Magnify Learning. And we don't, I mean, there might be a place for scenario projects, but a lot of times if we're pretending to be somebody out in the real world, then kids aren't fully engaged, right? They're not fully getting the experience of solving a real world problem, right? If your pamphlet goes into a doctor's office or I'm going to grade it on a rubric, right? There's just two very different levels of engagement that happen there. So, but at the same time, we don't expect everybody to start with a PBL unit that a 10-year veteran would have, right? So we all have to start somewhere. So we look at it as PBL versus a project. We've got a fancy graphic and all that good stuff. But there are some things that are in a project that might not be in a PBL unit, right? The
Yeah.
PBL unit typically is going to ramp that up with your community partner. Gosh, other pitfalls. That's a good question. I think the top-down mandate is a pitfall that happens sometimes. You get a really excited leader that says, wow, I went to a conference, I read Ryan's book, and now we're all going to do this. And it's like, that's great. Like, that's a great vision. Like, first of all, figure out your vision, bring in a leadership team to see where their vision's at and cast that vision, but then invite people into the vision as opposed to just slamming it down, right? Is meet everybody where they're at. Because again, our educators, our teachers in the classroom, they're passionate, they're working hard, they're doing all that they can to serve our learners. And I think PBL could be the twist that magnifies the work that they're doing. And they're probably already doing some portion of that, right? They've got voice and choice in there somewhere. They've got a presentation that could be tweaked. So meeting people where they're at and really finding the bright spots has been a place that we've gone to, but we've seen the pitfall of maybe the top-down mandate. The last one I'll mention that's a passion project of mine is succession planning. As you're talking to leaders on this podcast, you're doing really great work in a lot of different areas. How do you make sure that continues after you leave that position? Because a lot of our principals are going to move on after 3 to 5 years, which is totally fine. I guess part of the process, but how do we get systems involved and how are we bringing up the next person that's going to be in that seat so that those things continue? So succession planning is a piece that I think we overlook in education that our friends in business don't, right? Because they've got some other outside forces that force those things. And sometimes we I don't know that we give that enough care.
Right. Yeah. And succession planning in schools can happen in a variety of different ways, right? Because it could be an assistant principal that gets a principal job in another school, and that was the person who really was more hands-on with the instruction,
Right.
so the principal didn't go anywhere, and maybe the principal remains committed to using the practices but isn't the expert in them, and then there's a place of where do we get that guidance or support, and we didn't know this was going to happen. Right, it happened kind of quickly, so
Yeah.
I'm sure having processes that are always in place, you're always prepared for that, or succession at the classroom level. A teacher moves from the school, or there's this person changes to that role kind of thing, and all those micro successions, right? That it doesn't exclusively mean that the leader changes and a new leader comes in and says, I don't like PBL, or you haven't been doing PBL, we need to do it, and etc. So that's a good point. And also to your point of the challenges with the top down mandates, certainly I think that goes back to what are the outcomes that we're looking to achieve that we're not currently achieving, and okay, and because we need to get there, we need to put strategies in place. But just saying this is just the way I want everybody to do teaching without having a why, and this teacher is saying, well, my students are thriving with the way we're doing it, so why would I change it? And another one is saying, well, my students are struggling, so I'm open to trying something new, but it's not going to be successful unless I kind of get what we're trying to accomplish there. And balancing that, I'm sure, with what the benefits could be of the collective efficacy around teachers all doing it and being able to learn from each other, but trying to determine the right way to get there, I guess, with letting it evolve in a way that is organic in a sense, and it builds, and okay, we have one success and then we try to achieve a second one, and so on, and learn from one another. That if it's just happening in small pockets, that we might be missing out on making it even better. But if we're just making it a mandate, then that probably means that a lot of people are not going to fully invest in it either.
Yeah. We think that you can build the grassroots movement on purpose, right? I don't think it has to be an accidental spark somewhere. I contend that it is the leader's job to cast the vision, right? And now it doesn't mean that they go up on the mountaintop away from everybody else and come back with this vision and say go, but they do cast the vision and then they invite people into that vision. So again, I like the leadership team idea. I think teams are really important. You're gonna invite your coaches, APs, lead teachers. Hey, this is the vision where I think we can go. And like you mentioned, here's the vision, here's where we're at, and here's the gap, right? And if you can get everybody involved in that process of identifying the gap, then we're all in on board. And then it's the leader's job to say, here's the steps that we're going to take to go after that gap. And here are the resources and the training that we're going to provide to help
Yeah.
us eliminate that gap. But you definitely want it to be an us and a we, right? Not just a me.
Yeah. So as we talked about the terminology, and one of the reasons that I think about it is, one, sometimes, of course, when we are inside of something, we might be a little too married to the jargon of it in a way that either forces people to try to understand certain terms that don't really necessarily make a difference to them, right? But also, as practices are created, as they're implemented, as they become successful, then a lot of people then they start to lose their definition, and people start to
Mm.
just call all kinds of things PBL or whatever the case may be,
Yeah.
right? And so, relatedly, wondering from your experience, what are some of the things that happen in schools that people might call project-based learning that are not actually authentic project-based learning according to the way you would define and implement it?
Yeah, sure. So if you go for my geeky side of things, right, and I'm all in on PBL, right? Obviously at this point. So I'll just give a classroom example, right? And both of these are real life examples. Is some young learners get together and they're going to plan out these tiny houses for people that move into the community. That's awesome. So they bring in an architect. The architect talks to the class, and then they build out. They plan out these tiny houses, and they're for specific people. And their final project, they do an expo, and they show kind of via diorama style, right? These cardboard cutouts that they have of the layouts of these tiny houses that they've created, and they've collaborated. They've done some. They heard from a community partner, but the exact same unit was done in another school, and they actually built the tiny house. Like they got together with a builder, and the builder agreed to build these tiny houses for people in the community. I know one group that did it for people that were in a tough position, right? They didn't have housing. Another one did it for military families that were moving in, right? But at the end of the day, those learners had similar community partners. And at the end of the day, they could point to the work that was done from a third grade classroom. Because of third graders, these tiny houses exist, right? Because they collaborated. And there's almost like a visceral like change there, right? Of like, I helped build these houses when I'm 10, right? Or 10 or 11. And it's so empowering. And the same thing happens in, a third grade, different example, but they built the playground around their classroom or around their school. Sorry. They already had money for it, right? And they were going to just put one in. And the teacher said, well, what if my kids planned it? And they planned it around all types of different learners that might be in their school or might not be, and the different disabilities they might have or different abilities they might have. And so the kids learn empathy and all these people. But at the end of the day, there's this thing that was created, this problem that was truly solved because these learners were involved. And if they hadn't been, it wouldn't be the way it is. Right? It wouldn't be as effective. Right? If adults put in a playground, they don't necessarily think about every learner the way that the learners do. The learners actually went to other playgrounds and took notes, right? So for us, I think that's the biggest difference is when you bring in the authenticity of creating things, or maybe it's a passionate speech that you give at a school board meeting. It doesn't have to be a thing that you make, but learners are impacting the world around them right now. Right? So moving the why forward is kind of a phrase that we're starting to use more and more is like, hey, this is going to be really helpful for when you get to college. Hold on a minute. Like I'm a ninth grader. I'm trying to get through the day. Like that 4 years, I can't even see it, right? Most adults can't see 4 years ahead. But when you are working on something that's going to be completed within your school year, within the next 6 weeks, I can see that why it's important to me. And I think it's a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of our listeners are in school leadership positions. So they might not be the ones doing this at the classroom level, but certainly having a very important role to play as far as making decisions about the practices that they want to prioritize in their schools, ensuring that there's the right curriculum resource, professional learning, instructional leadership, etc., to support teachers. What are some of the important things specifically for a school leader to think about when determining if, how, why, when, where this all fits into what they want to do in their school?
Yeah, that there is a lot, especially if you're a school leader that hasn't done PBL in the classroom, right? You're like, am I qualified to do this? And of course you are, right? Because it's going to be a part of your vision. There's just some education that you'll need. My first step, I think, for everybody is to go do a school visit. Go find a place where you've heard that there's good PBL going on. That's why we have model schools across the country that you can go see. And when you go to those school visits, my favorite thing to do is because like we do a panel with teachers, with the administrator, and with students, but then in the in-between times, go talk to the learners and go see if they're really doing neat work, right? Like, but if once you step in there and bring some of your teachers, bring community partners if you can, parents, and go see if this is the type of school that you want to be. And I think that's the same for PBL or any initiative you're going to do, right? If you're implementing PLCs, before you go do that, go to a school when they're doing their PLCs and you go step in on them. And you get to feel, just by being there, you get to feel if this is really something that you want, because it is a commitment, right? If you're going to do like project-based learning, if that's going to be your new instructional model, however you implement it, we have a 3-year plan that we put schools through to where they have their own PBL certified facilitators. But I mean, that's a big commitment that you're making to really changing an instructional model, because there's mindset, there's culture. Now, obviously, I think it's worth it. But as a school leader, you have to figure out, is this the step that you want to take? I think a school visit is just undeniably the best first step.
Totally. So PBL Simplified is the name of the book. And so there's a lot of strategies for simplification. What's the, I guess there's a fine line somewhere between simplification and oversimplification, and ensuring that things are simple, doable, practical, while still protecting the integrity of what
Yeah.
authentic PBL is. Where is that line? How do we find ourselves on the right side of it?
That's a good question. So, yeah, so the title PBL Simplified, the idea is that it's not PBL watered down, right? So it still has hard edges, it's still authentic. But we've also done a lot of work over the last 10 years, right? Where we know some things that work. We've got group contracts that work. We've got implementation process. And actually, with the audience being school leaders in PBL Simplified, there's two chapters dedicated towards school principals, one on implementation and one on leadership. And so for me, the line again is the authenticity. But if you're getting PBL from Teachers Pay Teachers, or it comes in a box, right? It's probably not real PBL, because in my mind, right? So you've oversimplified it at that point. In fact, organizationally, we've taken the stance that we don't have a project library that's public. We do actually for people that are in our community, but that's because we've been able to give them mindset work around it. If we just give you a PBL unit to go do, you don't have the mindset yet, you don't have, I don't know how we could build in your local capacity for that, right? Your local community partners. For instance, if one PBL unit is super successful because you've got a really great bank CEO that comes in, and I give you that unit, but you don't have a really great bank CEO as one of your community partners, I don't know how that could be successful. So we don't do curriculum. We are actually a skills building organization. So we help teachers create their own curriculums through mindset and protocol. And for us, that's probably the line. I've never actually been asked that question. That's the simplification line, right? Is
Yeah.
because so we simplify the process and the structures from leadership and teachers, but we can't give it to you. We can't just
Right.
give you a PBL unit to do. For us, that's actually the line, because then you haven't been involved in the making of that. So you don't really know the heart and the mindset of the work.
Yeah. Let's, as we're sort of putting a little bit of a bow on this, if we can maybe illustrate a little bit of the change, like, and let's talk to a school leader again. Okay, I'm walking through the halls,
Yeah.
I'm looking in classrooms, and I'm thinking about what I'm going to see if I have teachers who are really doing some effective PBL, and how that contrasts with what I might be seeing now, or how it might contrast with PBL that's not really PBL or not done correctly, right? What are some of the things that I'm going to see happening in classrooms that are going to make me happy?
Yeah, great. So in the evaluation realm, right, there's always a piece of like, learners are 75% engaged. Right? 75% of my kids are engaged. It's like, the question is, how do you gauge that? Does it mean that 75% of the kids are quiet and doing what they're supposed to be doing? Because that might just
Mhm.
be compliance. Like, that does not mean engagement, right? So we have to define engagement correctly. Now, I also don't advocate that when you go in a classroom, it shouldn't be chaos, right? That you might see some collaboration, you might see kids moving around in stations, you might see some protocols being done. But I don't know, as a teacher, you can always, I think you can just tell, I think principals can too, the level of volume for collaboration versus the level of volume for chaos, where it's like there's a teacher, like a classroom management issue, right? And it should get to that classroom management issue. It should be controlled. And I don't even call it controlled chaos, controlled collaboration. And the other piece that I think would be interesting for school leaders is you begin to see teachers become more empowered and have more agency. We see again and again when teachers bring in PBL and they become a facilitator, if you will, they kind of see a shift in their role. Now they're saying, it depends on how you lead this, but they might say, hey, boss, I'm bringing in a community partner on Friday. Would you want to come in and see? And they're not asking for permission necessarily, right? Because you've already given that to them. You say, hey, go do this. It's good for kids. And you're starting to see that they're taking more agency and they're bringing in different aspects that you've asked them to, without you having to go in and like say, well, this month we're focusing on formative
Mhm.
assessment. So when I come in, I want to see it on the board, right? They're doing those things because they know why they're doing it. And they know that it's empowering their learners in a different way. So when you go in, to answer your question directly, when a principal goes in a PBL classroom, they should be able to go in and assuming you know the 6 steps, if you will, right? You kind of know where they're at in the PBL process, right? If there's a community partner up there talking up front, it might be an entry event. If it's a workshop, then you're going to see maybe some direct instruction, and then you're going to see an activity. You might see a lab. All those things, all those best practices that happen in a classroom every day, they're still involved in PBL. They're wrapped up a little bit differently. And then you might see an expo. You're going to say, wow, our multi-purpose room is getting used a lot more than it used to. We've got a lot more community partners checking in at the front desk, right? So I would think that those are some of the things that you're seeing. And what comes out of that, maybe one last thing, is that as community partners come into the building to see the amazing thing that your learners are doing, they're telling better stories when they go to Rotary Club, when they go to the chamber, and when they're at the soccer game, right? Yeah. They're starting to tell the stories about your school that are making the newspaper and that are noteworthy. That's exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ryan, you also have a podcast called PBL Simplified for some of our listeners who have the wheels turning now and they want to continue their journey to learn about this. What kind of things would you be covering on the podcast?
Sure. So PBL Simplified podcast, we've been going for 5 years now. So the 200th episode is coming up. We do showcases. So we actually just went through our model schools where we actually showcased different schools. So large district, small district, K-12 model, so that you could kind of hear about the different models from me. And then the next week, we actually interviewed one of the, what I call movement makers that are in the middle of the movement. So it might be a principal of that school. So you get to hear about the school, and then you get to hear from someone in the school. It's really designed in a lot of ways for school leaders. And then we also do teacher showcases where we'll bring in a PBL teacher to talk about one of his or her PBL units, which is a great one to pass on to your teachers.
Yeah, excellent. And so the book is called PBL Simplified. It's available from Amazon or wherever you get your books. Listeners, we'll link to that below so you can find it if you want to read more about it. The PBL Simplified podcast, we'll give you a link for that. Ryan, what other resources would you like listeners to check out on your websites or wherever?
Sure. We've got an online community that we've just started up. It's the most active PBL online community that I have found yet. So we actually have moderators in there that are on staff to make sure that things are continually moving and there's continually new content. But probably the easiest way, actually, if this piqued your interest, if you will, just go to whatispbl.com. That's whatispbl.com. And we've got some free resources for you specifically for administrators. So you can pick teachers or administrators, and we just give you a set of resources to get you started.
Excellent. Listeners, make sure to check all that out. We'll put the links below. We always make it easy for you. Everything's right there. So you can click through and find out, join the community, learn about more resources, learn about school level things that you might want to get support with, whatever helps you. It's all there for you. And please do subscribe to The Authority if you have not already. We'll have more author interviews coming your way every week covering all the topics that matter to education leaders, or you can head over to bpodcast.network to learn about all of our shows, find your next great listen, find anything that really solves the challenges you're having or piques your interest there. And Ryan, thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely, Ross. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the podcast. You just have such a wide array of guests that you bring on. It's a great asset for our school leaders. So thank you.
Thank you.
This episode was edited by Gage Sanderson.